You should have your sheets on Bible interpretation. It says figurative language at the top. If you don't have that, there's some more out there in the foyer on the table. That will be the sheet we're starting tonight. Trying to find my passage I'm looking for to start with. There it is. Okay. Figurative language, something that we don't talk about a lot except maybe just in passing. But we use figurative language all the time. And I just used it right there. Did you catch that? All the time. Is that literally true? No, it's not literally true. But it means much of the time. And that's a hyperbole, an exaggeration to make a point. So we use figurative language all the time, so supposedly. Likewise, the Bible is filled with figurative language. A lot of people don't grasp that or don't see that, and they need to see it. People need to understand this. And in order to properly interpret the Bible, we need to learn how to recognize figurative language when we see it. We need to know what it is, how to recognize it, and then how to interpret it. Because depending on the figure, it's going to be interpreted in a different fashion. So that's what this particular lesson is all about. The idea of figurative language, recognizing it, seeing it, trying to interpret it, you see. At the end, we're going to go through a number of different kinds of figures. That's on the back page. If you turn it over, it goes A to S. I don't know how many letters that is, 25, 20, no, 20, whatever it is. Anyway, there's probably more figures than that in the Bible. But those are a few of the more prominent ones that we'll talk about. But let's start off here by identifying figurative language. And this is a definition of figurative language from a guy named, the first definition is Webster. The second one we'll talk about in a minute is from Bullinger. But Webster's dictionary says a figure is expressing one thing in terms that normally denotes another. So you're borrowing, it's almost like an illustration, by which it may be regarded as analogous. So you've got two things that you're trying to compare, and that's what you're using figurative language to. You borrow the language from this and bring it over here to kind of compare it, and that's the idea of a figure of speech. E.M. Bullinger, who is a Bible, he wrote a whole book on figurative language, great figures in the Bible. And he says an unusual form, in this case a figure, an unusual form is never used except to add force to the truth conveyed, emphasis to the statement of it, and depth to the meaning of it. In other words, figures are designed to really create an impression. They're designed to create a depth of meaning that you wouldn't get with the literal. So that's the point of using figurative language. We need to be very careful about dangerous extremes. I've mentioned this in passing in all the lessons so far, but some people want to take everything in the Bible and literalize it. And you can't do that. It isn't going to work. And for this, just to illustrate, Matthew chapter 5, this is from the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, this has actually become a point of criticism for unbelievers. They use passages like this, I should say misuse passages like this to try and say the Bible can't be trusted. But in Matthew 5, verses 29 and 30, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Now, if you take everything in the Bible literally, you're going to have some trouble with that. Because, in fact, as I said, this is what the critics of the Bible say. Well, what kind of a God would tell you to pluck out your own eye? What kind of a God? He can't be a loving God to tell you to pluck out your own eye or cut off your own hand. And of course, what they're doing is taking something that's figurative and making a literal application of it. And you can't do that. It isn't going to work. If you say everything in the Bible is literal, you don't know what you're talking about, and it's not going to work. This is an example of this. And notice how this really puts emphasis on the thing. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. That's pretty drastic, isn't it? That's a drastic measure. And so as we think about what's the point he's making here?
Well, it'd be worth losing any and everything here on this earth to go to heaven.
Yeah.
No matter what it costs you. If you got to give up whatever, if that's what it takes for you to get to heaven, it's you need to get rid of it.
Yeah, and think about this from a literal, if you did take this literally, Well, I got an issue looking at pornography. Well, pluck your eye out. Is that going to fix the problem? It's not going to fix the problem because he's still got a lustful heart, doesn't he? The problem's not with his eye, the problem's with his heart. So the language is designed, and I think you said it very well, the language is designed to say, you do whatever it takes to get yourself right with God. And if you look at the context, the previous verse, verse 28, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery. So he says, you need to be careful about this. And if it's your eye that's the problem, pluck it out. And not literally, but you do whatever you need to do to keep that from being a problem. And just an illustration of this, and this is not the only application, but if you did have an issue with pornography, and there are Christians who have issues with pornography, and if that TV is a problem, what do you need to do? Get rid of that TV, yeah, or turn it off. And if turning it off ain't good enough, then throw it out the door. Get rid of it. You do what you need to do to be right with God, is the idea. You need to take extreme measures. Yes?
Jesus would never told us to hurt our bodies in any way, because our bodies are the temple of Christ. So we take care of it all we can.
Exactly. So you can't take this literally. That's what you're saying. Yeah, exactly right. And so you run into issues if you start taking everything literal. Look at chapter 6 and verse 2. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Have you ever seen anybody literally blow the trumpet? Everybody look! I'm getting ready to give this person some money. Nobody ever literally blows the trumpet. That's clearly a figurative expression. What's he saying? Yeah, calling attention to it. The blowing of the trumpet is a way of saying calling attention. If you blew the trumpet, that would get everybody's attention. What's going on? And he's saying, don't do that. Don't try to call attention to it. But I don't think I've ever seen anybody actually literally blow the horn. But that's just a vivid way of getting across the idea of making a show of it. Don't make a show of it.
In times past, and it may still be done, certain dignitaries and things, they would blow a trumpet when they enter some place. Or
yes, when the king would come in, they'd blow the trumpets and all that.
Announce that the king is here and all. I mean, and that's the idea, is going to put on a show.
Put on a big show, exactly. Yes.
I was just going to say a similar thing. In Europe, it's still being done just for tourists, but that's the way it was done for hundreds of years, that the town caller would come out and blow the trumpet if you had an announcement.
Yeah, hear ye, hear ye.
Yeah, or at nighttime, tell them what time it is, that it's time to go to bed. So
yes. And of course that was all designed, the blowing or the hollering or the hear ye was designed to get attention. Yeah, and that's the point he's making here. You can do your good deeds without having to announce it to the world. Just do it and don't say anything. The Lord sees it, and that's all that matters. Okay. Another one, Luke 14:26. We've talked about this one several times, but it's such an obvious one. Jesus said in verse 26 that we need to hate our family. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother and his wife and his children and his brothers and his sisters, and yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. But look how stark of a statement. That's why figures really add force. That's what this guy was saying here. It adds force. And so you think about hating your family. And that's a stark statement to make, and it adds force. And he says, you cannot be my disciple unless you do this. And it's designed to get your attention. But if you took it literally, you'd have conflict with other passages, wouldn't you? Love your parents, love your children, love your spouse. You'd have a conflict with other passages. So it's really, as some have said, it really means to love less. The good commentary on this is from Matthew 10. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So you need to love father or mother less than Jesus. And so to hate kind of means to love less, is really what he's saying. But he uses the stark language to get your attention and to add force to the statement here. But it's not designed to be taken literally. And then in John 10 and verse 9, Jesus said, I am the door. I am the door. Does anybody think if you raised up Jesus' shirt, you'd see a doorknob right there in the middle of his belly? Well, of course not. Anybody think if he raised his arm up, you see hinges right here on his side like a door? Of course not. When he says, I am the door, that's not literal. Not in the least. But what is he getting across? The way in, yeah. Door is an entryway. And so I am the door. You're going to get in through me. If you're going to go to God, you're going to go to heaven, going to get into salvation, it's going to be through me. I am the door. I'm the one you have to go through. And so again, it adds force. It's a stark and colorful way of saying something that adds force to the statement, but you wouldn't take that literally. Nobody is going to take that literally unless they're just way out there in La La Land. You just wouldn't take those kind of things literally. And notice right there, just right off the bat, 4 figures of speech. And the Bible's loaded with them. One kind after another after another. Now, the other extreme is where people take everything in the Bible and make it figurative, or make it, as they would say, spiritual. They spiritualize everything. And I use the example of this with the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. Let's flip over there and look at that for a second. But this is, you see this, and we've talked about this in other studies, other classes, but with the AD 70 people, there's a small, very small contingent among our brethren who believe that AD 70 was the end. When God judged Jerusalem, that was the end. That was the final judgment. That was the resurrection of the dead. Everything's done. It's all done. And as I said before, if this is heaven, I'm really disappointed. I'm really disappointed. But to do that, because it sounds crazy, and it is crazy, but to do that and to make it work, they take passages like 1 Corinthians 15 and they spiritualize it. Well, this ain't talking about literal resurrection. No, you don't understand Paul here. It's not a literal resurrection. It's a spiritual resurrection. And it's the resurrection of the church out of the ashes of Judaism. After God destroyed the city of Jerusalem, then you had the church resurrected out of the ashes of Judaism. Judaism is gone and it's destroyed, and now you have the resurrection of the church, and that's how they explain 1 Corinthians 15. Or perhaps that's how they explain it away. Because he's clearly talking about a bodily resurrection here. Who's the first one he talks about being raised? Christ. And what was nailed to a cross? His body. What was buried? His body. What was raised? His body. And if Christ is raised, then we're going to be raised. And it has to be talking about a bodily resurrection. But these AD 70 people, they've got to explain that away. Because they'll tell you, they don't believe in a future resurrection of the dead. They don't believe your body's going to come back. That's not going to happen. And so they've got to explain that away. So they take and spiritualize all this stuff.
They're going to get into heaven.
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I don't know what they would do if you pressed them on it, because they're basically saying that there's no way to know anything about the future because everything the Bible says about the future has already happened. Okay, Jesus has already come back. There's already been the resurrection. There's already been the final judgment. Well, then, if that's all true, how do you even know, to your point, how do you even know what's on the other side of death? You don't have a clue. Don't point to the Bible. Don't you dare point to the Bible. You done told me that's all fulfilled. So don't you dare point to the Bible and tell me you know what's on the other side of the grave. You don't have a clue. And so you raise a great question.
What hope they would have. I mean,
yeah.
To me, it's kind of like, I always wondered that about the Sadducees. You know, they didn't believe in
resurrection,
angels and resurrection and things. They didn't believe in the spiritual or meaning of the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
So, well, what was their hope?
Yeah.
I mean, I ain't never really understood that on that.
Yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the Lord, he talking about the Lord's Supper. We eat this bread and drink this cup till he comes. Well, according to them, he's already come. So why are they still taking the Lord's Supper? Yeah, they may as well be fishing, because if the Lord's already come back, you don't need to take the Lord's Supper. And so they run into all sorts of things. But what that really is, and be thankful that you've not been troubled with it, some churches have been, but what that really is, when you start reading after these people, it's an intellectual high for them. Because they think they figured out something that you're too dumb to get. That's what it comes down to. And so, well, I know this stuff and you don't know. Let me help you. Let me help you with it, because all you people out there in the church, you've just been deceived all these years and you're just too dumb to get it, and let me explain all this to you. So it's a big intellectual high for them because they think they figured this out, and nobody's ever known this for 2,000 years. Nobody's ever known this, but we know it. And that's what it's all about. And it's pitiful, and it has troubled churches, believe it or not. There have been people who fell for this stuff. But it comes in because they take these passages and instead of taking them literally, they spiritualize them. See, so you got the extremes. That's what I'm trying to say. With almost every Bible doctrine, you've got extremes. You got people who run to one extreme over here, and then in reaction to it, some people run way over here to the other extreme, when the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. And of course, we're going to find that by looking at what the Bible actually says and trying to interpret properly what the Bible actually says. Not trying to make everything literal, not trying to make everything figurative.
It reminds me of what was said about like Martin Luther and some of those people that was trying to do the Reformations or whatever it was. They was, they had seen all this stuff that the Catholics have been teaching and doing and for years, and then they're trying to get away from that, don't agree, and then they go
all the way over
the
faith
other way.
Yeah.
No, that ain't right either.
Exactly.
But I mean, and it's easy to happen. You try to teach against something, and we need to be careful. We don't need to try to teach again a false doctrine so bad that we're teaching a false doctrine the other way. We don't.
With the old preachers used to say they've gone past Jerusalem and on down to Jericho. They've gone too far the other way. So yeah, and that's what happens. You overreact and you go clear over the other way. Try to find the truth. That's what we want. All right. A word of caution about figures. This comes from D.R. Dungan. He wrote a book on, the word is hermeneutics, but it's interpretation. It's what we've been studying. He wrote a book on interpretation of the Bible. And he says, and this gets back to, do we take everything literal? Do we take everything figurative? And the answer is no and no. It's a mixture. And so figures are the exception. Literal language is the rule. So as you approach a passage, that should be a guiding principle. In other words, I'm going to take this literally unless there's some compelling reason not to. Okay? If there's some compelling reason not to, then I'm going to look at a figure, but I'm not going to start out with the figure. I'm going to start out with the literal. So figures are the exception. Literal language is the rule. Now, this is all in your notes here, by the way. And so we're not to regard anything as figurative until we feel compelled to do so by the evident import of the passage. In other words, hate your mama? Well, that kind of compels me to think that's figurative, see? So if you don't take the figurative approach until you've exhausted the possibilities in the literal realm, and then you kind of move over there. And even here, great caution should be observed. We are very apt to regard context as teaching some theory which we have in our mind. So we think something is true when it's not necessarily true. And having so determined, see, this is a mistake so many people make. They decide what they believe first, and then they go to the Bible and try to prove it. That's backwards. You should go to the Bible with a blank slate. Figure out what it says, and let that be your guidance. Don't figure out what you believe first and then go to the Bible to try to prove it. That's completely backwards, because then you end up bending scriptures to fit your already established belief, see. So we're apt to regard context as teaching some theory which we have in our minds, and having so determined, you've got that already made up in your mind that you're going to believe this or that or the other, then anything to the contrary will be regarded as a mistaken interpretation. Well, that has to be figurative then. You're 80-70 people. That can't be literal because we don't believe that. So it has to be figurative, see? So they're starting out with an assumption to begin with, and everything has to be bent and twisted to fit the theory. And that's completely backwards approach to Bible study. Continuing on in that quotation, he says, if the literal meaning of the words shall be found to oppose our speculations, we are ready to give the word in question some figurative import because it doesn't match up with what we've already made up our minds it says. See? So he says, yeah, that's a big no-no. You don't do that. You got to be careful not to do that. We give the word in question some figurative import that will better agree with our preconceived opinions. Let us be sure that the meaning of the author has demanded that the language be regarded in a figurative sense, and that it is not our theory which has made the necessity. So that gets back to what I said before. When you come to the Bible, you try to come. It's difficult, admittedly so, because we all come with our background. You were raised a certain way. You were taught a certain way by your parents. You were taught a certain way in this region of the country. You were taught a certain way in the culture, in the country you live in. And so there's certain things that kind of factor in, and you got to try as best as humanly possible to just lay that all aside and come to this thing like a blank slate. Come to the Bible like a blank slate and try and figure out what this actually says and what it actually means, rather than making up your mind ahead of time and then going to it. See, that's the backwards part. You don't want to do that. Okay, any questions or comments on this so far?
The Bible is hard to understand in places, but
Yes.
what we need to know to get to heaven is not hard to understand.
Yes, and I think that's an excellent point, and it's a good place to insert it right here, because sometimes when we get it, this kind of study can get a little difficult and a little taxing sometimes. And understand this: if it's something God wants you to do, I guarantee you it may be figurative, but it's plain enough in the Bible that you can see it. There are passages, as you say, that are hard to be understood, but those ones that are that tough really don't affect your salvation. It's not going to determine whether you go to heaven or not. But being baptized, I'll get to you in just a second. Being baptized, that's pretty clear. That's going to have a factor on whether you go to heaven. Living a moral life, that's pretty clear. And what morals are, that's pretty clear. And you don't have to, there's no guesswork about it. It's clear. But some of this other stuff is a challenge, but it's not going to affect your salvation.
Well, it shows that it is for common people to understand, and yet we don't see many scholars or intellects to understand the most simple things in the world. They come up with all kinds of complicated answers when it's just so simple anybody could understand.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of cases, to your point, especially if you're dealing with somebody who is an atheist or an evolutionist, they've already made up their mind what they believe. There is no God, and evolution is the way things were done, and so they refuse to accept the simplest of things that you can read right there in the Bible. I'm not going to accept that because I've already made up my mind that there is no God. So this book doesn't mean anything to me. And I've already made up my mind that evolution is the way the world came into existence. So anything you say to the contrary, I'm going to automatically disregard. Even though it's simple and clear and it's there for everybody to see, they're not going to see it because they've already made their minds up. Was you going to say something, Keith?
Brother Plunkett used to always talk about all these denominations and all these different teachings out there. They put their slant. That's the way he referred to it. They got said, the Bible don't need my slant on it, don't need yours, he said we need to just try to understand the best we can. And don't put our slant to it. That's the idea you're talking about having a preconceived. We've got an idea. Yeah. So we're going to make this passage.
We're going to bend it to fit.
So you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to misunderstand it to make it fit what you believe in it.
And that's actually what rightly dividing means, to your point. When he says rightly dividing the word of truth, literally, it's a figure of speech, but literally, to cut straight is what rightly dividing means. And so the idea of cutting straight, we use a similar expression about people. We say he's a straight shooter. What do we mean when we say he's a straight shooter? He's honest, yeah. And so to cut straight, you got to be honest with it. You've got to be straight with the Bible. Be honest. Don't try to bend it and twist it. Don't come to it with your mind already made up. Be honest as a student of the Bible. What does this really say, and how does it affect me? How does it apply to me? And that's what it means to rightly divide the word of truth. Okay. Anything else before we move into the next section here? Okay. Now, recognizing figurative language, we need to recognize it when we see it. And there's some hints here. I give you 8. There may be others, but I put 8 down here on the list. One of the things is that the context may indicate that it's figurative language. And I just cite some examples here. These are examples, but they could be multiplied. These aren't the only passages that teach these things, but these are just examples. Well, Psalm 22, and while you're turning over there, remind you that Psalm 22 was written by David, first of all. David lived about 1,000 years before Christ, and Psalm 22 largely was fulfilled at the cross. And it's that passage where David talks about the crucifixion. You know, you start out with that verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus actually said those words when he hung on the cross. You come down here to about verse 16. They pierced my hands and my feet. So a lot of the things you see here in Psalm 22 are events that occurred right at the cross. Okay, and I think that's why Jesus said those words, by the way, in verse 1. He was calling attention. He was calling everybody's attention to look around you. What you're seeing here right now is written in the Scriptures. In Psalm 22, the very things you're seeing happening to me right here, right now. He's calling attention to that. But in that context, in verse 6, I am a worm and no man. Well, you ever seen a worm who could talk? Is he really a worm? Of course not. That's a figure of speech. So the context, if a man says, I am a worm, obviously he's not a worm. He's making a comparison. I'm like a worm in some fashion. In this context, I think it's despised. You know, I'm a worm, I'm no man, I'm a reproach of men, despised. Just like you would despise a worm, they despised him, is the idea. And so it adds force and it adds color to the expression. He could have just said, I'm despised, but he said, I'm a worm. People see me like I'm just a slimy old worm. Ugh, you know. And so it adds color to it. But when a person says, I am a worm, clearly that's not literal. So the context can indicate that. The other one I used there in Luke 13, we've talked about before, when Jesus said about Herod, go tell that fox. Go tell that fox. Now he's talking about King Herod. Now, nobody really thinks King Herod had a bushy tail and pointed ears. Nobody really thinks King Herod was a literal fox. So context makes it very clear here. He's not talking about a literal fox here. What's he saying about Herod? Sly like a fox. That's right. Exactly right. Another way to recognize figurative language is that the literal meaning would be impossible. I cited Matthew 8:22, and I've got another one on your notes there too. It's not on the chart, but it's on your notes. But let's go to Matthew 8 first. Matthew 8:22, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Well, try to take that literal and see how far that'll get you. You can't take that literally, obviously. What's he talking about here?
Some things are more important than others.
Yeah, he's talking about priorities and spiritual death. Let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Now, he is in the context here, verse 21, let me first go and bury my father. See, that's a literal death and a literal burial. And he said, follow me, let the dead bury their own dead. Let the spiritually dead handle that. You wake up and follow me, is the idea. So if you try to take that literally, you would have an impossibility, because people who've passed away don't do stuff like that. They don't bury other people. They don't do anything. They're not able to do so. And then I got Matthew 26. This is from the Lord's Supper. These are all in your notes here. Matthew 26, verse 28. Last Passover supper. And during that supper, Jesus institutes a new memorial for the New Testament. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples. And he said, take, eat, this is my body. Now, you can't take that literally. This is my body. Because he's standing right there with the bread in his hand. This piece of bread is my body. No, your body is standing in front of me there holding the bread. So you can't take that literally. So what does he mean when he says, this is my body?
Represents,
yeah. It's if you took a penny out and held it and said, this is Lincoln. Oh, no, that's not Lincoln. Lincoln, I've been to Lincoln's tomb. That's not Lincoln. This represents Lincoln. It's an image of Lincoln. It's a representation of Lincoln. And so this bread represents, it's not literally his body. It represents his body. And I've heard some people just all come unglued, at the table. You shouldn't stand at the table and say, this represents his body, because Jesus said it is his body. Well, I know he said it is his body, but he meant it represents his body. I mean, let's be real here. That bread is not literally the body of Christ. But if you go to the Catholic Church, that's exactly what they believe. When the priest does his little hocus pocus, that bread becomes the literal body of Christ. They call it transubstantiation. That's the name they give to that doctrine. The priest, when he blesses the bread, it actually becomes the literal body of Christ. And the fruit of the vine, hocus pocus, kaboom, it becomes the literal blood of Christ. That sounds kind of gross to me. Think about eating the literal body of Christ and drinking the literal blood of Christ, but that's their theology. That's what they actually believe. And they actually believe too, by the way, that you can get remission of sins through that kind of an act by actually partaking of his body and partaking of his blood. So they link it to your salvation. They link it to remission of sins. But obviously, Jesus is speaking figuratively because he's standing right there, holding the bread. So if this is his body here, that little piece of bread there can't be his body in the literal sense. Can't be. It clearly represents his body. Same thing with the blood in verse 28. This is my blood. He hasn't been as much as a pinprick yet. No blood running out of his body yet. It's fixing to, but no blood running out of his body. It's all coursing through his veins. But this is my blood. No, it's not literally his blood. It represents his blood. And there's a name for that. It's on the back. We'll go over that later when we get to the different types of figure, but it's called a metaphor. Okay, it's a metaphor. This represents my body. Not literally my body, but represents my body. So the literal meaning is impossible here. You can't take that literally and make any sense out of it. Okay. Another way to, well, boy, where did the time go? Okay, we'll have to quit there. I'm about a minute over. We'll pick up 2 weeks. We got meeting next week, isn't it? Or week after next.
I think next week's correct.
Okay, next week, yeah, pick up right there where we left off next week then. That's right. I'm a little off on that.